Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Gage and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format between weeks 8 through 14 in order to give ourselves some more context as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into the week and how that potentially can affect the player's upside. After we talk about matchups, of course, we'll then transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings as I'll share with you guys my perspective and opinions in regards to the position and how I think it's all going to stack up when it's all said and done by the end of week 15. Again, this is the first week of many of our fantasy football playoffs, so it's one and done. We're trying to win and, of course, capture a 2021 fantasy football championship. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing for the entirety of the rest of the season, going till week 18 and beyond. So if you have not yet already, please subscribe to the channel. Click the like button down below to show your support. I do really appreciate that. And let me know down in the comment section if there's any wide receivers that I did not mention today that you guys think should be a top 36 play in this given week. Outside of that, of course, check out Underdog Fantasy. There's a link down in the description of the video. There's another way to play fantasy football, whether or not your season is over, or whether or not you want to play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, whether it is their weekly contests, their pick'ems, and much more best ball drafts that are going to be taking place this week and going into the NFL playoffs. Please check that out. There's a link down in the description. If you decide to sign up, use promo code Andrew today, and Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Very generous offer from them. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about week 15 and matchups. Again, we want to always find the most advantageous positions for our respective receivers. So I've gone ahead and calculated how many points defenses have given up to opposing wide receivers as of the last 6 to 7 weeks based on how many games these respective teams have played. As you can see, the Minnesota Vikings followed by the Houston Texans, Atlanta Falcons, they are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers as of late. Of course, the Minnesota Vikings by far and away with 41.16 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receiver cores. I mean, that in itself is an unbelievable number. Now, when we look at the opposite end of the spectrum, of course, we have the New England Patriots, Carolina Panthers, Buffalo Bills, Philadelphia Eagles. Of course, all of these secondaries have a prime stud number one cornerback that shuts down opposing wide receivers, and their safeties and the rest of their DBs are obviously at the top tier level, and that's why they continue to have great performances against opposing wide receivers. Either way, just wanted to go ahead, present these statistics to you guys so you can make the most educated decisions this week in terms of your start and sits. Now that I've given you some context in regards to how many yards, how many touchdowns some of these secondaries have given up to opposing wide receivers, we'll of course refer back to these statistics as we talk about each respective wide receiver in order to give you some more context. So let's go ahead and do that just right now. Let's talk about our top 36 wide receiver rankings going into week 15. Again, do not forget, rankings are always subject to change. As the week progresses, there is a variety of different scenarios that can pop up, whether it is injuries and or players on the defensive side of the ball missing, specifically on Sunday morning, like we always do, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We talked about the fact that the top two cornerbacks for the San Francisco 49ers this last week were not going to play. And there's a reason why I moved up Jamar Chase and T. Higgins higher than where I had them ranked in my respective video. Things are going to change on a weekly basis, so do not take this as the end-all, be-all. Be sure to come out on Sunday mornings, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time to get your questions answered and to check out my updated rankings. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about it, shall we? Beginning with our number one wide receiver, and currently the number one wide receiver in fantasy football. Of course, it is no surprise that we have Cooper Kupp here. Besides the fact that Cooper Kupp's coming off of a 24.8 fantasy point performance against a pretty tough secondary, he'll go against the Seattle Seahawks this week. And to be honest, not worried in any capacity. This is a man that's averaging 8.7 receptions per game, 114 receiving yards, and 0.92 receiving touchdowns per game. He's breaking a bunch of records and every single week continues to outdo himself and have himself performances that continue to carry our fantasy teams. Of course, he's an automatic play regardless of matchup. He's a fantastic wide receiver, and for those of us who were able to draft him this season, boy, are we lucky to have done so. Moving on, we have Davante Adams, our number 2, taking on the Baltimore Ravens. Of course, with Marlon Humphreys being out, this is going to certainly play a big role in the entire matchup between the Green Bay Packers and Baltimore Ravens. Without one of their top secondary members, being able to defend Davante Adams, of course, he is going to tear them apart. That's exactly what he did against the Chicago Bears this past Sunday night. 121 receiving yards on 10 catches, 2 receiving touchdowns, 29.1 total fantasy points. Of course, in the recent weeks, we've seen the Baltimore Ravens struggle against opposing wide receivers, specifically Diontae Johnson, a stud number 1 outside wide receiver, 8 catches, 105 yards, 2 touchdowns himself. I think this is a very capable number in which Davante Adams himself can eclipse. I mean, in the last 3 weeks, he's had 100 plus receiving yards consecutively. So why not go ahead, accompany that kind of performance with a touchdown once again, and have himself a great fantasy performance. Moving on to Justin Jefferson on number 3, taking on the Chicago Bears. A couple things that I wanted to mention. Of course, Justin Jefferson versus the Chicago Bears, he has had himself a great history against them, specifically in 2020, in which in the 2 games that he took them on, he had 8 plus receptions in both contests and over 100 receiving yards in both of those contests. I mean, just recently, this last Sunday night, like I just mentioned, Davante Adams torched that secondary. So why not Justin Jefferson, one of the wide receivers that is continuing to take over the league in the first 2 years of his young career, continues to dominate every single week. Now, another stat that I wanted to mention that continues to give me confidence in regards to Justin Jefferson this week has to do with the fact that Adam Thielen will probably not be playing this week due to the high ankle sprain that he sustained a couple weeks back. In the 2 games in Justin Jefferson's career thus far that he has played without Adam Thielen, these are his fantasy point contributions. Of course, this last week, 17 fantasy points against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and in 2020 against the Carolina Panthers, put up 22.5 fantasy points in which he scored 2 touchdowns. So in the 2 games without Adam Thielen, he has scored 3 touchdowns. Of course, the ball's got to go in some direction, and as we continue to see, I think Justin Jefferson is going to continue to ball out here. Moving on to Tyreek Hill on number 4. Again, Tyreek Hill's a stud wide receiver. But we have had a little bit of a lackluster, couple performances here as of late, which has made some Tyreek Hill managers worried. But I wouldn't be too nervous about the scenario because typically when Tyreek Hill has a bad performance, specifically under 10 half PPR fantasy points in a given week, he'll turn around and in the following week put up a great performance. Specifically this season, in the 4 games that he has had less than 10 fantasy points, he has followed the next week averaging 15.55 fantasy points per game. He is always going to have himself a bounce back game, and I think against the Los Angeles Chargers on a short week, there's a very good opportunity for Tyreek Hill to take the top off of the opposing defense and put together a great performance in which he can score a touchdown, get the applicable yards, and get a great overall fantasy performance to help us get to the next round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving on to Chris Godwin at number 5. I mean, Chris Godwin has been unbelievable as of late specifically. In the last 2 games, he has had a total of 32 targets. I mean, that kind of number is unheard of in the National Football League, yet back-to-back weeks of unbelievable reception numbers, over 100 receiving yards. Yeah, he hasn't been able to score a touchdown in the last 2 games, but you don't need touchdowns when you're getting receptions and yards at the capacity in which Chris Godwin has been able to accomplish. Nonetheless, they take on the New Orleans Saints, the 5th easiest matchup at the wide receiver position. Last time they took on the New Orleans Saints, Chris Godwin had another one of these games to remember. 8 catches, 140 and a touchdown. I expect him to have very similar numbers. And as long as Mike Evans continues to struggle against that organization, Chris Godwin will be asked to do even more. Without AB in the lineup, again, we continue to look at it every single week. Chris Godwin this season in the games without Antonio Brown has been averaging 16 fantasy points per game. I think he'll be able to very easily accomplish that number this week. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb, our number 6. Now, a couple things that I wanted to mention. According to Pro Football Focus, when you go ahead and look at where CeeDee Lamb has been lining up in the last couple weeks, specifically in the last 2 games, he is lined up in the slot position 80+% of the time in the offense. So, when we go ahead and think about, okay, CeeDee Lamb going back into the slot position, where does that open up opportunity for him? Obviously, back-to-back weeks of over 10 plus targets, and obviously has performed via yardage. Hasn't been able to score touchdowns, but we're not worried about that because this week he has the privilege of taking on the New York Giants. And to be honest, the New York Giants this season have been horrible against opposing slot wide receivers, and that's exactly the role that CeeDee Lamb is going to be exposing, specifically as of late. Josh Palmer, 5 catches, 66 yards, and a touchdown. Jaylen Waddle the week prior, 9 catches for 90. Chris Godwin, 6 catches, 65 and a touchdown. Renfrow, 7 catches, 49 and a touchdown. Tyreek Hill, 12 catches, 94 and a touchdown. Cooper Kupp, 9 catches, 132 touchdowns. We're talking about wide receivers that have just recently played against the New York Giants secondary and predominantly play their snaps in the slot position. Of course, CeeDee Lamb is going to be another one of these wide receivers that is going to continue the trend of dominating the New York Giants secondary. Moving on to Diontae Johnson. Again, we talk about it every single week. Death, taxes, and Diontae Johnson getting over 10 yards. These are things that are guaranteed in life. But the unfortunate nature of Diontae Johnson's 10-plus targets is that sometimes, sure, he's not going to get a touchdown. James Washington will steal one. Pat Freiermuth has been on a burner as of late. And, of course, we'll have Najee Harris stealing a couple touchdowns. But we're not too worried about that because as of late, Diontae Johnson has been 10 plus points guaranteed. In fact, the only 2 games this season in which he hasn't put up 10 plus fantasy points, one was without Big Ben Roethlisberger at quarterback. We had, of course, Mason Rudolph against the Detroit Lions. He wasn't able to surpass 10 fantasy points. In the other game, he didn't have 10 total targets. But luckily for him, he's had, 6 consecutive games of 10 plus targets. He continues this trend and continues the ball out every single week. Taking on the Tennessee Titans, the 9th easiest matchup at the position. They have played pretty well in terms of stopping the run as of late, and a lot of teams have been forced to pass the ball. I expect the Pittsburgh Steelers, as they have in the last couple of weeks, to be a second half football team, specifically against the Los Angeles Chargers and Minnesota Vikings as of late, as what they've put a lot of pressure on opposing defenses in the second half. Diontae Johnson should have a great performance. Moving on to Ja'Marr Chase. Again, like I mentioned earlier when we talked about matchups, the fact that the number 1 and 2 cornerbacks of the 49ers were out last Sunday morning, of course, we wanted to start Ja'Marr Chase, and we did. And we ranked him accordingly, and boy, did he have himself a great performance. 5 catches, 77 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns to pretty much take his team to the next level. They really had to force a comeback there, and I'm glad that they were able to do so because they know that they're capable of doing such things. Now, going into this upcoming week's matchup against the Denver Broncos, again, it's Ja'Marr Chase. He is a top wide receiver on one of the better offenses in the National Football League, and as long as this man continues to see red zone targets and targets of 20-plus yards and is among the top in the league in terms of getting those kind of opportunities, as long as those are going to continue to be there, and T. Higgins continues the ball on the opposite side of the field, who will certainly be pulling double coverage in his own right, I think Ja'Marr Chase automatically becomes a play and our number 8 for the given week. Moving on to Keenan Allen. Hopefully he is going to be practicing today fully and going to be playing on Thursday because, again, it is Wednesday, and in 24 hours we'll know whether or not he is going to be at a full capacity, but I'm expecting him to play. And if in fact he does, there is a very good possibility in which the Kansas City Chiefs may be in trouble because L'Jarius Sneed, unfortunately, lost a family member and did not play this last week. Of course, we saw Hunter Renfrow go for an incredible performance. If L'Jarius Sneed, their slot corner, is not going to be present, then of course we're going to have a scenario in which Keenan Allen is going to be able to take over. And the last time he took on this defense earlier this season, 8 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown for 15 fantasy points. So why not go ahead and just completely go off? There's a possibility. Now, if L'Jarius Sneed plays, then of course, we're on equal ground. I still think that Keenan Allen is going to have himself a great performance, but the upside is going to be limited to an extent because the competition will be a little bit more difficult. But with that being said, the opportunity that goes in the direction of Keenan Allen has been unmatched by a lot of other wide receivers. In 6 consecutive games that he has played, he has gotten himself 12 plus fantasy points. Now, the reason why those numbers exist, because in those 6 consecutive games, he's been averaging 11 plus targets per game. As long as that continues to be the case, of course, Keenan Allen is a must start. Moving on to number 10, Deebo Samuel, who was a surprise play this last week, considering the injury and the timeline that they had originally set for him, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, trying to get him fully healthy before he returns, but nonetheless returned. The stat that I wanted to mention, and that many of you who are Deebo Samuel managers have noticed, but for those of you who have not paid attention to Deebo Samuel's number as of late, in the last 3 games, he only has 3 total receptions. He's only gotten 1 reception per game. Everything else that he has accomplished has been via the running game. In the last 3 games, he has 22 rushes for 218 yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. That's 45.8 half PPR fantasy points and 15.26 fantasy points per game just off of rushing statistics alone. He himself is an RB1 as of the last 4 weeks. And of course, as long as it continues to be the case with only 8, 6, and 8 total rushing attempts in the last 3 games, then by all means, we're starting him. But just understand that even though he takes on the Atlanta Falcons, there's no guarantee he's going to catch the ball. But if in fact he does, it's going to be a great matchup to do so either way. Moving on to Stefon Diggs, our number 11. Now, the only reason I have Stefon Diggs a little bit lower than I typically do is mainly because his limit in terms of his ceiling of production is going to be a little bit skewed in comparison to what it usually is, because we always know that the touchdown's always possible. He can get himself into that 16 to 20 point range. But unfortunately, this week he will have one-on-one coverage with Stephon Gilmore. Again, we talk about Gilly Lock as one of the best cornerbacks in the National Football League. And according to Pro Football Focus, within the first 6 weeks of him returning and to play, of course, being traded from the New England Patriots to the Carolina Panthers, he's obviously contributed and shown that he is still a top-flight cornerback. And there's a reason why I'm a little bit nervous about Stefon Diggs. Sure, maybe Gabriel Davis will pull a little bit of coverage, but I think primarily it is going to be a one-on-one matchup between these two. And sure, I think the yardage is going to be there, the catches will be there, but I think the touchdown is going to be very difficult to be able to, at least guarantee in this regard, making Stefon Diggs a little bit of a lesser play. Moving on to Mike Evans. Again, Mike Evans, he's had his storied history against the New Orleans Saints. And of course, we talk about it every time that the matchup comes up. We have to be careful about what we're anticipating or expecting to see. Sure, this man's coming off of 18.1 fantasy points and a great overall performance in which he caught every single target against the Buffalo Bills secondary, but it's a little bit different when you take on the New Orleans Saints. It's almost personal for him because every time he matches up against Marshawn Lattimore, it just seems to be like, Mike Evans kind of disappears a little bit. In fact, in the last couple games that he has played against them, in fact, the last 4 games, 2020 and 2021, he's only averaged 8.4 fantasy points per game against the New Orleans Saints. I mean, earlier this year, he was able to put up 2 catches, 48 yards, and a touchdown. And, that has been a common thing. In fact, in 3 out of the last 4 games against the New Orleans Saints, he has scored a touchdown. So great. As long as he's scoring touchdowns, that's fine. But the yardage hasn't been there, the receptions hasn't been there, and he hasn't been open very often. Nonetheless, we're going to hope that Mike Evans can at least find himself in the end zone, good enough yardage to make himself a viable play. Without Antonio Brown in the lineup, this man's been averaging 15.01 fantasy points per game this season, and as long as that continues to be the case, we trust him despite the matchup. Moving on, we have our wide receiver 2 conversation, beginning with Tyler Lockett. The wide receivers that we're going to mention from here on forth have been guys that have been on fire as of late and deserve to be perhaps mentioned in the top 12, but just couldn't make it there this week. Either way, you're must starting these players. Tyler Lockett, as of late, has been an unstoppable force in the National Football League. In regards to weeks 11 through 14, he's been the number 4 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, averaging 16.4 fantasy points per game. They take on the Los Angeles Rams this week, and to be totally honest, it doesn't matter what the matchup is. As long as Russell Wilson continues to look in the direction of Tyler Lockett, of course, he's going to have value because DK Metcalf is completely invisible out there or owes him money or something of that in exchange. I know there's other reasons, but we're not going to mention those in this episode. But either way, I think Tyler Lockett continues to prove himself as an automatic play every single week. The fact that he's been averaging 16 points per game in the last 4 contests that he has performed in just continues to validate his value and reason why you have to have him in your lineup this week. Moving on to Hunter Renfrow, the thumbnail of today's video. Hunter Renfrow has been unstoppable, specifically from weeks 9 through 14. Of course, the contribution with Darren Waller being out and the targets going in the direction of a Hunter Renfrow has certainly helped. But nonetheless, this man has been averaging 14.75 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time and has been the number 6 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. It has just been unbelievable to see Hunter Renfrow go from being, a wide receiver underutilized, if not, just completely ignored last season for the Las Vegas Raiders to being not only their number 1 receiving option, but the number 16 overall wide receiver in half PPR as we currently stand here today. 13 catches, 117 and a touchdown in last week's game. I think Darren Waller, from what I saw today, did not practice yesterday either. That is not a good sign, and that continues to help the overall baseline value of a Hunter Renfrow. Moving on to T. Higgins. Again, another one of these wide receivers that has been insane as of late. T. Higgins, in the last 3 weeks, from weeks 12 through 14, has been the number 2 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, only behind Cooper Kupp. I mean, just in itself, that is a crazy number, but nonetheless, he's been averaging 19.53 fantasy points per game. He has surpassed 100 receiving yards in 3 consecutive games, and as long as this offense continues to see him as a pivotal point to continue to send the ball in his direction and get him involved, get him those deep ball throws that eventually get him in the conversation of scoring touchdowns, by all means, of course, we're firing up T. Higgins. He's been incredible, and we're going to start him once again this week. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle, another wide receiver that weeks 11 through 13 has been the number 3 overall wide receiver. Throughout that span of time, was averaging 18.1 fantasy points per game and also had 10 targets per game with 30 total targets through those 3 games. Of course, taking on the New York Jets in week 11, he was able to put up 16.6 fantasy points, and that's exactly what he'll be able to do this week, probably against the New York Jets, a very familiar matchup with Tua in a scenario in which he may not have a starting running back in the backfield this week with all of them being on the virus list. There may be a scenario in which they're throwing the entire time, and we know who the number 1 receiving option in this offense is, of course, is the rookie Jaylen Waddle. Moving on to Amari Cooper. As long as Amari Cooper continues to be, of course, the number 1 outside receiver, he is going to have himself more and more value. Of course, he will have to take on a little bit tougher coverages in that regard, but nonetheless, I think Amari Cooper is a talented enough receiver to be able to, battle through that. Like last week, 5 catches, 51 yards, and a touchdown for 13.6 fantasy points. The last time he took on the New York Giants, who he will have the privilege of doing this week, he had himself 3 catches, 60 yards, and a touchdown. He has a pretty good history against that defense, and as long as the matchup continues to be in his favor, I think the targets will continue to be, obviously sent in his direction. There is a possibility that this game gets into a blowout scenario in which Amari Cooper isn't utilized, but I'm hoping that won't be the case prior to him at least getting into the end zone once. Moving on to our number 18, we have Brandin Cooks. Of course, we love Brandin Cooks, but the entire conversation last week was whether or not Davis Mills was going to get him involved enough to make him a valuable enough fantasy prospect. But regardless of our speculation, of course, Brandin Cooks delivered an incredible performance. 11 targets, 8 catches, 101 yards, 14.1 fantasy points. I mean, in the last 2 games that he has played with Davis Mills as his starting quarterback, he has gotten himself 14.1 fantasy points. And then against the Los Angeles Rams earlier this season, week 8, got himself 6 catches, 83 yards, a receiving touchdown, 17.3 points. He takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars once again, giving up the 11th most points to opposing wide receivers in week 1 with Tyrod Taylor. Had himself 132 receiving yards against the secondary and 15 plus fantasy points. Why not again this week? Why not Brandin Cooks? Moving on to Brandon Aiyuk, our number 19. Listen, I think Brandon Aiyuk is a stud wide receiver. We talked about it all offseason, but unfortunately, it did not transition early in the year. But as of late, in the last 3 weeks of the season in which Deebo Samuel has been active, Brandon Aiyuk is averaging 14.87 fantasy points per game. In those 3 games in which Deebo Samuel has been active, Deebo's only gotten himself 3 receptions. So they've obviously looked in the direction of George Kittle and Brandon Aiyuk to be their simple receiving options, as Deebo Samuel's pretty much transitioned to being a running back. So with that being the case, and we seeing that there's been a scenario in which when Deebo Samuel was out, Aiyuk was only able to put up 7 fantasy points, it makes me think, well, Deebo Samuel playing the number 1 outside role, continues to pull double coverage. It opens up more opportunities for Brandon Aiyuk, and as long as Deebo is active, Brandon Aiyuk deserves to be in the conversation of being a top 20 wide receiver, because not only is he getting the opportunity and delivering on every opportunity he's given, but he's also taking on the Atlanta Falcons this week, and they are a joke of a secondary and defense that should be exposed this week. Moving on to Van Jefferson. Now, the entire conversation around Van Jefferson is going to regard whether or not OBJ plays. If OBJ plays, I think OBJ could very easily be a top 20 wide receiver, maybe even take this position. But either way, Van Jefferson and OBJ have both scored 3 consecutive weeks of a touchdown. And as long as that's going to be an active part of their overall fantasy role, then by all means, they are must-starts every single week in an offense that continues to put up incredible points. Not only that, they take on the Seattle Seahawks. The last time we saw Robert Woods against this defense, of course, was that Thursday Night Football game. Robert Woods had himself a breakout game there, 12 catches for 150 yards. If we're in a scenario in which we don't have an OBJ available, Van Jefferson may be able to play that role, may be able to get an increased amount of targets, which will give him enough fantasy value to be, once again, a must-start play. Moving on to Mike Williams, our number 21. Again, Mike Williams should have had himself a better performance this last week. Unfortunately, his teammates in the form of Jalen Guyton and Josh Palmer completely went nuclear, both of them scoring over 15 fantasy points. But Mike Williams, 6 catches, 61 yards, will take it. Either way, this week, Thursday night, takes on the Kansas City Chiefs. The last time he took on that defense, he went for an unbelievable amount of stats. 9 total targets for 7 catches, 122 yards, and 2 touchdowns. If we're in a scenario in which we're going to get back to getting, Mike Williams involved in that kind of aspect and where they're getting him end zone targets, they're throwing the ball to him in the red zone, then by all means, Mike Williams will be able to deliver. But again, the Kansas City secondary has improved, quite mightily since the week 3 contest in which they took on the Los Angeles Chargers. So it will be a little bit different, but either way, that is why we downscale Mike Williams to this 20-ish role. And that is why we have him at number 21 this week. Moving on to AJ Green. The information that I heard earlier today is that DeAndre Hopkins is expected to miss the rest of the regular season. An unfortunate happening. Obviously wasn't healthy when he returned, busted his leg up again, and we're in a scenario where AJ Green probably is the number 1 outside contributing wide receiver to this team. And yes, the receiving core for the Arizona Cardinals has been unpredictable all season long, whether it's been AJ Green, Christian Kirk, Rondale Moore, Zach Ertz, who have stepped up in their own right. But I think AJ Green, as long as he's going to be the number 1 outside receiver, taking on the Detroit Lions secondary, by all means, I think there's a very good argument to start him this upcoming week and give him the opportunity, of course, that typically DeAndre Hopkins would have on a weekly basis. Anything that DeAndre Hopkins would typically see is now going to go in the direction of AJ Green, who should be able to step up with Kyler under center and have himself a great performance. Moving on to DJ Moore, number 23. I'm not 100% certain whether or not he's going to be healthy to play this weekend against the Buffalo Bills secondary, which again is one of the tougher ones in the National Football League. But without their number 1 cornerback, Tre'Davious White, it is certainly going to be difficult for them to stop a DJ Moore-esque wide receiver. Again, he's coming off of a week in which he had 6 catches on 10 targets for 84 yards. Of course, had a little bit of an injury there. But going into this upcoming week, I'm thinking to myself, if we're in a scenario where I did hear that Sam Darnold is going to be reactivated from the injured reserve, if we're going to have a trio of quarterbacks, I don't really care who it is, as long as they get the ball in the direction of DJ Moore, continue to get him double-digit targets, then he's going to have value regardless of the upcoming matchup. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr., I am a little bit worried about it, considering the fact that this team is a run-first kind of approach, of course, with Jonathan Taylor, being the MVP of that team and perhaps the league at this point, and of course, the sheer possibility in which Michael Pittman gets double teams for the entire game. We know exactly what Bill Belichick loves to do, and it's take away the number one threat of the opposing team, and stopping the run is going to be very difficult. Like we talked about yesterday, the New England Patriots since week 8 have given up 5.34 yards per carry to opposing running backs. So if we're going to be a scenario in which, of course, Jonathan Taylor is going to be able to run the ball successfully, it may make it difficult for Michael Pittman to get as many opportunities as we have seen him have earlier this season, which is why we have him at number 24. I respect the talent. I respect that if, in fact, he's given opportunity, he can deliver on it. But for right now, it's at a little bit of a limited capacity. Moving on to the wide receiver 3 conversation, we, of course, begin with Chase Claypool of the Pittsburgh Steelers. The only reason I trust Chase Claypool is because I've kind of garnered more trust from Ben Roethlisberger. Again, Ben Roethlisberger, as of the last 5 weeks, has been a completely different quarterback from the 8 weeks prior to that, in which he was putting up lackluster performances of 0 to 1 touchdowns per game. As of late, has been able to light up the scoreboard and get his wide receivers implemented. Of course, Chase Claypool coming off of a game in which he had 9 total targets, 8 catches, 93 yards, 13.5 fantasy points. I mean, I don't remember the last time that Chase Claypool was able to have more fantasy points than Diontae Johnson in a given week. It's been quite some time that we have seen that. So as long as he'll continue to be involved in this offense, and of course the matchup against the Tennessee Titans, a favorable one at that, we'll be able to at least kind of give him more opportunity in a contest that hopefully they can go ahead and just continue to throw the ball in. I think Chase Claypool has himself a pretty good chance of having a great week here. Moving on to DK Metcalf. I understand it, guys. DK Metcalf, from weeks 11 through 14, has been the number 55 overall wide receiver in fantasy. He doesn't deserve to be on this list. I understand it. In the last 4 games, he has proved nothing that deserves and kind of garners the respect to put him on this list. But I do believe that talent will overcome the lack of opportunity at times. I always preach that opportunity leads to success. And though his opportunity hasn't been at the level as some of these other wide receivers, much less the wide receivers on his own respective team, 8 targets last week wasn't the worst thing in the world. He had himself opportunities to score and wasn't able to, complete them, whether it was he himself, the inaccurate passers, and or a Houston Texans defender stopping him from being able to complete a big play. Either way, I think that, DK Metcalf, he's a special wide receiver. And I'm going to go ahead and mention him here. Play with caution, of course. The last time he took on the Los Angeles Rams, despite the fact that he was being covered by Jalen Ramsey, 5 catches, 98, and 2 touchdowns. There's a possibility we can get back to that form, and I'm hoping that's going to be the case. Moving on to our number 27, we have Darnell Mooney taking on the easiest matchup of the week. The Minnesota Vikings giving up, 41 plus fantasy points per week to opposing wide receivers. Now, I understand. The Chicago Bears wide receiver core has been a mess as of late. There have been times where we expected Darnell Mooney to perform, and of course, Allen Robinson just recently came back. But the fact that we only saw Jakeem Grant and Damiere Byrd, have great performances last week is pretty unfortunate. Nonetheless, I think they'll be able to get back on track. And of course, Mooney should have himself a great game here, specifically because the Minnesota Vikings, as of late, have just been giving it up to just about anybody. The Pittsburgh Steelers, their wide receivers combined for 23 catches, 266 yards, and a touchdown. Detroit, 17 catches, 197, and a touchdown. Green Bay, 14 catches, 296, and 3 touchdowns. Specifically, also 2 out of those last 3 games, it's been against division rivals, Detroit and Green Bay. The Chicago Bears probably know the Minnesota Vikings pretty well, and I think they'll be able to expose that secondary once again as well. Moving on to our number 28, we have Russell Gage. Again, Russell Gage has been a pivotal part of this offense. Without Calvin Ridley being a weekly contributor, many of us have had to look in the direction of players that just really shouldn't be started. But luckily, Russell Gage has kind of gotten himself on a path in which he's able to get himself a decent amount of targets, decent amount of yardage, and at least be a decent wide receiver 3 play in a half PPR, sometimes a wide receiver 2 play in a full PPR. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about what the opportunity is going to look like this week for Russell Gage. The San Francisco 49ers give up the 8th most points to opposing wide receivers. Specifically, against the slot wide receiver role, they have struggled in the last 6 weeks here. The matchups in which wide receivers have been able to take advantage of it. I know Tyler Boyd didn't have a great game, but 4 catches, 55 yards. Lockett the week prior, 7 catches, 68, and a touchdown. Thielen, 5 catches, 62, 2 touchdowns. Shenault, 5 catches for 50, and Kupp, 11 catches for 122. If we go ahead and just look at the recent matchups against predominant slot wide receiver options, Russell Gage should be in a perfect position to have himself a great week here. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown, another one of these wide receivers who may be able to benefit because of the fact that the opposing team he plays, the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 14th most points to opposing wide receivers, really just can't stop the slot wide receiver role. Cooper Kupp, 13 catches, 123 and a touchdown. The week prior, of course, Lockett, 4 catches, 115. Jakeem Grant, 5 catches, 62 and a touchdown. I mean, when we're talking about a wide receiver option who has had 12 targets in each of the last 2 contests, of course, continues to pull the eye of Jared Goff. I mean, Jared Goff is taking on a division rival of the past. Of course, as he played with the Los Angeles Rams, he knows that Arizona Cardinals defense pretty well. He's played against that defensive coordinator more than a couple times. So why not go ahead, get Amon-Ra St. Brown once again established in this upcoming week's matchup? I expect that to be the case. And as long as TJ Hawkinson is dealing with an injury, Amon-Ra St. Brown's opportunity, in my opinion, continues to go up every single week. Moving on to number 30, we have Gabriel Davis. We've talked about it earlier this week. I think of all the waiver wire wide receiver options you could have picked up, perhaps he may end up being the most valuable one because of the offense that he is associated with. Because of the fact that we have Stefon Diggs on the opposite side of the field pulling coverage. I mean, we saw earlier this season through the first 6 weeks where Emmanuel Sanders was able to put up great performances on a consecutive weekly basis, scoring touchdowns because of the amount of coverage that, of course, Dawson Knox on the middle of the field was pulling, and Stefon Diggs on the outside was pulling. So why not trust the potential of a Gabriel Davis? Though he is taking on a very tough secondary in the Carolina Panthers, outside of Stephon Gilmore, the rest of their cornerbacks have been injured this season and really have left them shorthanded in that regard. So if, in fact, Stephon Gilmore, as I anticipate, is going to be guarding Stefon Diggs, I think Gabriel Davis has a very great opportunity. Besides the fact that he has gotten himself a boatload of red zone targets as of late, scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 games, he continues to run that red zone slant. And as long as that's going to be in the repertoire of the Buffalo Bills offense, then by all means, Gabriel Davis will be associated with my lineups. Moving on to DeVante Parker, our number 31. Like I mentioned earlier, with Jaylen Waddle, if in fact this backfield is going to be missing Myles Gaskin, Salvon Ahmed, and Phillip Lindsay due to the virus IR list, we're in a scenario in which they may have to pass the ball the entire game. And if we're going to be in a scenario against the New York Jets, one of the easiest matchups at the running back position, then why not go ahead and just pivot, throw the ball against the 13th easiest wide receiver matchup this upcoming week? I think DeVante Parker, of course, prior to the bye week, had himself a decent game. Hopefully we'll be able to come back out and prove to everyone that he deserves to be on the field and deserves to be the number 1 outside wide receiver and to garner more than 8 targets on a weekly basis in this offense. Moving on to Marquise Brown. I don't know who's going to be playing quarterback this week. Is it going to be Lamar? Is it going to be Tyler Huntley? They did go and sign another quarterback this week, Josh Johnson, formerly of the New York Jets earlier this season. Had himself a decent game, but either way, because of the fact that Marquise Brown does not have a stable quarterback or a healthy quarterback at that, we have seen a lot of underwhelming performances as of late. The fact that Jair Alexander is back for the Green Bay Packers just makes me think that Marquise Brown is just a very unstable play. There's a lot of inconsistency and volatility that is going to be associated with his performance, and that is why we have him at 32, despite him having the upside of 16 plus points. He's unfortunately been putting up only 6 points per week in the last couple games here. Moving on to Jerry Jeudy, our number 33. Again, Jerry Jeudy seems to be the number 1 receiving option of that team. I don't think it'll be a cakewalk like last week in which they were able to dominate that Detroit Lions defense, run all over them, and just impose their will. When you take on the Cincinnati Bengals, it will be a little bit more difficult, but nonetheless, I think Jerry Jeudy will have himself a great opportunity here in which he'll be able to get himself the ample amount of targets, considering he is the number 1 receiving option in this offense, and find himself some great fantasy value. Moving on to Michael Gallup. Again, now that we've gotten CeeDee Lamb in the slot position, Michael Gallup plays exactly where he's supposed to, on the outside role. We know that him and Dak have a chemistry, and they'll continue to get targets in Michael Gallup's direction. Again, he had 9 targets this last week, while other guys like Amari Cooper only had 7 targets. Michael Gallup is a huge part of this offense, and as long as that's going to continue to be the case, and the fact that the New York Giants are really just struggling in the secondary, they were able to give up, a touchdown to Jalen Guyton and Josh Palmer. There's a lot of points to be had here. This could be a blowout and help the potential value of a Michael Gallup. Moving on to KJ Osborn, our number 35. As long as Adam Thielen is out, regardless of the matchup, this man is going to see himself an ample amount of targets and will have touchdown ability because he's got the speed to take the top off the opposing defense, and he's obviously got the skill and perhaps play that Adam Thielen role and be able to get himself in the conversation of 10 plus fantasy points this upcoming week. Our final wide receiver option, it is DeVonta Smith. I don't know what we're going to expect to see this week. It is just a complete mess within that offense. Sometimes he performs, sometimes he doesn't. It is really a coin toss, but hopefully Jalen Hurts is going to look in the direction of his number one receiving option and get him more involved. Either way, there could be a lot of players that we associate with number 36. Let me know down in the comment section what you guys think should be at number 36, or perhaps is there a ranking that you didn't even see, a player, perhaps like a Terry McLaurin, that you'd like to see on this list, and where do you guys rank them? Let me know down in the comment section. Either way, those are our Week 15 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Tomorrow we'll talk about quarterbacks and tight ends before the Thursday night football game between the Chargers and Kansas City Chiefs. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy, link in the description. Be sure to subscribe if you have not yet already, and click the like button down below. Thank you very much for the support. And until next time, guys, tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.